Hello, everyone. I'm Jennifer Hausler. I'm Assistant Director of 92Y Talks. Thank you so much for your patience with the time change tonight, and welcome all of you to tonight's panel, and a special welcome to those of you who are joining us by webcast tonight. The Metropolitan Revolution will be on sale after the program in the Hall of Mirrors. I hope you'll pick up a copy. We've been very fortunate to work with Ellen Oakes and her amazing team at the Brookings Institution on this event, and we couldn't have asked for better partners. There will be questions taken tonight. The questions will be taken on cards. You can hand them to the ushers, and they'll bring them backstage, and they'll be passed along to our moderator. Our moderator tonight is George Stephanopoulos. He serves as anchor of ABC's Good Morning America. He's anchor of This Week with George Stephanopoulos, and in addition to his anchor duties, he is the network's chief political correspondent, and he reports on political and policy stories for all ABC News broadcasts and platforms. Elections, debates, breaking news, he's there on the air. Please welcome George Stephanopoulos.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be back here. Welcome all of our other panelists. Now, you see the empty chair right there. I think it's not possible to tweet from the Holland Tunnel. but that's where Cory Booker is right now. He's stuck in a little bit of traffic, but he's on his way. He's going to be here any minute. But we wanted to get started first with our other panelists, starting with the authors of the book that brings us here tonight. It's called The Metropolitan Revolution, coming from the Brookings Institution. Bruce Katz, the vice president and program director of the Metropolitan Policy Program there, joins us right now. Also a veteran of the administration as well, the Clinton administration.
Absolutely.
That's right, back at HUD. My good friend Jennifer Bradley, a fellow at the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, also a co-author of this work, and the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, Judith Rodin, also former president of the University of Pennsylvania and provost at Yale. And congratulations, because I understand that Rockefeller Foundation now celebrating its centennial.
Yes, this year.
This year, 100 years of supporting, among many, many other things, what we're going to be talking about tonight, how to make cities vibrant and alive. But Bruce, let me begin with you, because I have to say, when I first got the book, when I first heard about the book, there are two terms I had never associated, Brookings Institution and revolution. They don't usually go together. I think
Absolutely.
of the pinnacle of the establishment in Washington, D.C. But why don't you start out? Because you begin the book in an explosive way. You say there's a revolution stirring in America, a revolution stirring in American cities. Describe what it is and what can be done to foster it.
Sure. First of all, thanks for being here. Thanks to the audience. Jennifer and I see something very exciting happening in the United States. I mean, there's no secret to anyone in this room that this country faces supersized economic challenges, and the federal government, for all intents and purposes, has left the building. But there is good news. We see cities and metropolitan areas stepping up and powering the country forward. We see them doing the hard work to grow jobs and make their economies more prosperous, because they're investing in infrastructure. They're making manufacturing a priority. They're equipping workers with the skills they need. They're integrating immigrants into the economic mainstream. They're linking small businesses to global markets. Our book talks about Los Angeles and Denver, Houston and Portland, Northeast Ohio and Detroit, and yes, New York City. We don't think this is the exception. We see a wave of innovation moving through this country, and essentially what's happening is leadership is pushing down from the national and state governments to cities and metros. Why is that happening? These are very powerful economies. The top 100 metros sit on only 1/8 of the land mass. They're 2/3 of our population. They're 3/4 of our GDP. And on every single indicator that matters, whether it's infrastructure, human capital, innovation, they're 75, 80, 85, 90% of the national share. There is no American economy, essentially. What we have is a network of metropolitan economies. That's why we're so powerful as a country. There's one other thing about cities and metros. The federal government, state government, they're governments. Cities and metros are networks of leaders, corporate, civic, yes, government, but also philanthropy, labor, environmental. And these folks are very powerful by themselves, but when they come together, they can do grand things together with the challenges they face and the opportunities they can leverage. So the bottom line about this book is in the next decade, given what is happening in Washington today, change will happen mostly where people live. This is a challenge, but this also could be a liberating moment for city and metropolitan leaders all across the United States.
I want to bring Judith in, but first, one quick follow-up. You talk about this happening all over the country. Is it happening in places without regard to partisanship?
You know, when Jennifer and I visit cities, it's a hard time at times to understand who's a conservative, who's a liberal, who's a Democrat, who's a Republican. What we see are people who feel passionate about their place. And Judith and I have all really written about this. We call this almost a pragmatic caucus. These are people who put place over party, collaboration over conflict, and evidence over dogma. And that's why they're able to come together. As we move up our system, partisanship begins to poison the well. But at the local level, people just want to get stuff done.
And another thing they do, and one of the things, the hallmarks of successful metropolitan areas, which I know you've worked on a lot, Judith, is this whole idea of urban resilience, bouncing back from challenges.
Well, that's the critical challenge of the 21st century. If you think about what the metro regions are facing, it's really two challenges. One, to build economic growth, to build prosperity, and to do it in a way that increases opportunity and really expands the pot. But the other is to be able to rebound more quickly from the shocks and stresses that seem to be thrown at metro regions, at cities in the US and all over the world.
It's going to happen.
Climate-induced storms, no longer 1 in 100 years, as we know well in New York after Hurricane Sandy. Social unrest and stresses, not so much in the US, but we see this increasingly in cities around the world. Floods that aren't coming from climate change, Bangkok. And the consequence for cities is that there's economic disruption, there's loss of life, human disruption, well-being, all of the things that we need and know we will need to recover from after Sandy. And so we recognized at Rockefeller, as we've done in the 100 years, where we're looking both for innovators, and so we fund Bruce and Jennifer in this metropolitan program, but we funded Jane Jacobs to write The Death and Life of Great American Cities.
I did not know that. Wow.
Recognized this sort of unknown person with big, thick glasses who came in one day and they said, well, let's give her some money. We think she may be onto something. We think that this nexus between resilience and economic growth is really critical, because we can do all the growth, but unless we really help cities to fail safely, rebound more quickly, uncouple some of the deep networking. Take a smart grid, for example, which we've recommended for New York, so that various sources of energy supply can come in depending on what's available at the time. The pricing is set accordingly. So you can have the kind of program like a smart grid that fosters prosperity and economic development when we have manufacturing relying on electricity or a whole financial system. You know, we were down at the New York Stock Exchange not because they were flooded, we were down because they had no power. So how we really, in leading these cities, help the mayors who are so increasingly empowered, who have really the vigor, the energy, the thought process to take control, to be able to do so in this new way, we think is part of this exciting 21st century opportunity.
And Jen, let's talk a little bit more about this idea of resilience and bring it home here to New York City. Judith talked about Hurricane Sandy, but of course we also all remember back in 2008, you know, the near collapse of the markets, certainly the bankruptcy of Lehman Brothers goes out of business. One of the things we saw here in New York is that, to borrow Rahm Emanuel's phrase, they didn't let the crisis go to waste. Talk a little bit about the response of New York City to that financial crisis and this whole idea of game changers, which I know you think is critical across the board.
Absolutely. So in New York, they've created what we think is a great example of the metropolitan revolution in action. and that's the Applied Sciences Initiative. It's 3 campuses that will educate graduate-level engineers and scientists and sort of introduce them, infuse them into the New York economy, not only to create new kinds of tech companies, but also to bring technological activity or a technological surge to New York's existing industries like fashion, media, and medicine. The New York Applied Sciences campuses have cost the city about $130 million for infrastructure. They're going to leverage about $2 billion so far in construction and other related investments. Over the next 3 decades, they're going to bring about $33 billion in economic activity, about 50,000 jobs, and just about 1,000 new companies. We think that this is a great example of the metropolitan revolution because it is such a game changer, as you were saying, George. It will really change the trajectory of the New York economy for decades to come and make it a different kind of place. The way New York went about this, I think, demonstrates what you were talking about, Judith, which is a sense of resilience, and it shows other cities a model of what this resilience could be. In 2008, when the bottom dropped out of the financial sector, the mayor and the Economic Development Corporation here knew they had to do something different. But the great thing is they also knew that they did not themselves have all the best ideas about what to do. So they reached out to a wide network of people, about 300 corporate leaders, a couple of dozen community groups, philanthropies, university presidents, and they said, we don't have this knowledge. What do you think? What do you think needs to happen? What has to change in the New York economy for us to be robust, resilient, going forward? The answer that came back was, we need more tech talent. You know, they heard from the head of Macy's who said, you know, today Macy's is a technology company because of all of our online sales. So they went from this network to creating a vision, and that vision was New York as a tech-infused economy. Not New York as the next Silicon Valley, but New York as marrying the great things that were already happening here with a new technological bent, and New York as the place that was going to define and solve the urban problems of the future. Rapid urbanization is a huge opportunity and challenge, and New York said, you know what? We know about bigness. We know about size. We know about moving people. We think we can tell other cities and sell other cities on solutions for these issues. So they had the network, they had the vision, and they have used those 2 things to create this game changer. Applied Sciences campuses came about through an international competition. It was big, it was bold, and it told the world, we want to do something different here in New York. And again, that's going to lead to about $30 billion in economic activity, tens of thousands of jobs, and a lot of new companies. We think that's a great example of what the metropolitan revolution is about.
So Bruce, that's a big success story, and you guys talk about the importance across the board of these networks. You say that's almost the first requirement, but let me push you on that, because I can imagine a world where, and we've seen it in other places, you know, you bring the network together and what you get is paralysis by analysis. How do you prevent everything getting stuck in that meeting?
Yeah, I think, first of all, and you know, this is an overused term, you need leadership, right? When Rahm Emanuel was elected mayor of Chicago, he basically said, I've gone around the city, and if I ask 10 people what the economic strategy for this city is, I get 15 different answers, right? So when mayors get elected, this is usually the best time, and Judith and I were just talking about this, it's the best time to go to them and say, you know, you got a new start here. So you can't do this by yourself. You don't run the economy, but you can sit with your major employers, your universities, the unions, the philanthropies, et cetera, the community associations, and begin to chart a new course. And that's what he did. You know Rahm. There was a couple salty words in the process here. But we sat and we worked with the mayor and this network of leaders, and essentially World Business Chicago was deputized to lead this, and McKinsey also participated. And 18 months later, what you have is really a unified narrative of where the city of Chicago and metropolitan Chicago needs to go.
So what's the key? Rahm is forceful, but how do you get the buy-in?
Okay, if you don't have a mayor, right, I think the message of this book is there are other leaders who have the power, who have the resources, who have the energy, step up and begin to change. Northeast Ohio, great story. Network of philanthropy and business stepping up to support a network of small and medium-sized manufacturers. The mayors are not really in the game, but what we have are a set of institutions and individuals who basically in a 9-year period have brought manufacturing back to Northeast Ohio. They are attracting private capital, they are retooling their facilities, they are retraining their workers. It would be great to have leadership in elected office. If you don't have it, don't wait.
You know, 'cause
And,
Mayor,
and I think that sense of not waiting actually stops the analysis circle. Most of the stories that we tell in our book originated in a feeling of crisis, in a feeling of people saying, oh my God, what we have been doing, the stewing and the report reading and the report writing, and I shouldn't say this, right? Because at Brookings, we do a lot of reading and report writing versus
but
my
now
boss.
they're revolutionary.
Yeah, exactly. They all say, we have got to change. So the circumstances are what create this sense of urgency. It's the bottom has dropped out of your economy, either in a big way that you notice or in a way that's kind of been leaking for 10 years and you wake up and say, we can't continue this way. It's an environmental crisis. There is some spark that brings the network together where they say, we got to throw all the old crap out the window and do something
Judy,
different
and George,
now.
on
We
this.
challenged them to become, we said, stop being only a think tank, become a do tank. So you know all of this. You have this extraordinary repository of great evidence and really wonderful ideas. Go out there and be a consulting practice for these various regions and teach them that the economic model has changed in the United States. We're talking about how to grow our economy, and yet all of the economic models that the states and cities had in the late part of the 20th century was sort of a race to the middle. They were all competing with each other to give away more tax breaks and more tax incentives for somebody to build in their state or in their region. Recognize that in the 21st century, your competition is Shanghai and Beijing and Bangkok. It's not the state next door.
Talk a little bit more about that whole idea. You're funding people who you don't want just to think, but to do. I assume that's somewhat a new way for the Rockefeller Foundation and other big foundations to work. So what exactly are you trying to get them to do, and can it be replicated in other cities?
We absolutely think it can be. So just as Jennifer talked about what New York did in the tech center, we start with the hypothesis that not all the great ideas are inside philanthropy, if they ever were. And so we're looking, we run competitions, we're out there meeting people on the ground. We want to access. We now have the technological tools, We the World, crowdsourcing, and new ways of running competitions for all of these great ideas. And then we feed those ideas to our grantees often. So some of it's coming from the top down in terms of their expert knowledge, but we think our role is to feed that knowledge from the ground, and in our case, global knowledge that can benefit the United States and vice versa. But importantly, we think we philanthropic capital should de-risk the first layer for these investments. So if we're talking about building resilient infrastructure, often commercial capital doesn't want to come in the first tier because they think it's too risky, or they don't know the city or the region doesn't have the right environment for setting up a public-private partnership. And so we do that work with and for them. So after Sandy, we helped New York State set up a New York Infrastructure Bank, which will enable public-private partnerships to leverage our federal dollars that are coming in and really, you talk about leverage, bring billions to every million to continue to get that leverage. When we, New York City put together a fund to acquire land in the 5 boroughs to build new affordable housing, and yet they couldn't give tax credits until the land was assembled and the pre-construction work was done, so the commercial banks didn't want to come in. So we put together a group of philanthropies that put in the first tier of risk capital, $50 million, and we said, we're willing to lose that if there's any problem. And then the commercial capital at the rate of about 300 to 400 million was willing to come in at the second tier. New York guaranteed it through a debt structure, and we're in the middle of this new boom of building affordable housing. So working with the metro regions, and that's one of the reasons we're so excited about what they're identifying. So we're helping them to identify which regions are the most aggressive and able to do this, but we're also coming in behind them and figuring out what the innovative financing mechanisms are to get
Bruce,
some of this done.
Judith mentioned the leveraging of the federal dollars. You talked about the federal dysfunction.
Sure.
At the top, and I'm wondering if you can just go a little bit beyond that. Are we seeing the metropolitan area simply filling a vacuum in the absence of any action by Washington? Are we at the point now where the paralysis in Washington, which has led to a sequester, is actually, inflicting harm and making all this work more difficult?
Several things. I think we're seeing a structural shift fiscally in the United States. We've all known about the aging demographic for some time. Well, it's hit. And so if you look at the president's budget, you look at the Congressional Budget Office, what they're saying is the next 10 years, we're going to shift and need to spend about $1 trillion more per year on Medicare and Medicaid. And we'll need to spend more each year on Social Security. What that's going to do is begin to crowd out, squeeze down federal investments in infrastructure, in education, in housing, in workforce, in research and development. Essentially what Judith is describing are cities and metros they see the fiscal writing on the wall, and they're beginning to compensate for the withdrawal of federal dollars or for the federal government being a prescriptive, technocratic, bureaucratic partner, unreliable. When sequestration happened, I can tell you all over the United States, mayors, business, civic, philanthropic, university leaders basically said, we don't have a partner anymore. In the middle of a fiscal year, they just basically pulled out $100 billion.
So did the project stop?
Well, what you see are folks figuring out, problem solving, coming together and saying, okay, now what do we do? We've got public capital still coming from the federal government, reduced, but we can find new ways to leverage up philanthropic, private sector capital. And this can happen actually in some of the most distressed places in the country. Detroit, okay, everyone knows about what's happening in Detroit. Okay, what they're building there is a new light rail transit system along the old Woodward Corridor. $100 million of local money, $25 million of federal. It's almost the new math. They're building a bridge over to Canada. Who's financing it? The Canadians in a public-private partnership. There's a local energy firm that's building and investing in new energy infrastructure, clean energy. And on that note,
a man who knows how to make an entrance. We're talking about Detroit, but we're going to get to Newark in a second.
Why we need infrastructure investment.
this is seamless.
Knew down the line.
As soon as I said clean energy.
Before we bring in Cory, let me follow up on Detroit. You read the headlines about Detroit every single day. You just talked about a lot of the hopeful stuff happening, but it must be, Judith, the ultimate test of resilience. Can Detroit come back? Can Detroit survive?
I had a great experience early in this enterprise that Bruce talked about, because I was asked to come out and meet with all of the university presidents and tell them what we did in West Philadelphia when I was president of PAN, and how we got a consortium of business leaders and foundations and universities, and we revived an extraordinarily distressed neighborhood right on our doorstep. And the foundations in Detroit have stepped up. The business community has stepped up. There are a lot of people moving back to downtown Detroit. It is you can feel the energy, but it really does take all of these sectors to be willing to do that. And Bruce's point is his first point was a really important point. With all due respect to amazing mayors like Mayor Booker, in some cities you don't have that kind of mayoral leadership. And what happened in the past is that everybody else sat back and grumbled and waited till the next election. And now what we're seeing is a tremendous amount of action from other sectors. And I love that. Maybe that is the new American model, that people feel empowered to really take back leadership and get things going if things aren't working the right way. We should embrace that and we should promote it.
Mayor Booker, welcome.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
We have some fans here. As you know, we've been talking about this metropolitan revolution. So why don't you just start out by talking how Newark fits in to this and how you've tried to be a revolutionary in that
Well,
respect.
first of all, I'm here because of Detroit. My grandparents were part of that Black Northern migration that settled in the manufacturing world. My grandfather worked in the Willow Run bombing plant, and it really secured my family into the middle class. And this is sort of the story of American cities. But I think that the next phase of this country really will be, as Bruce rightfully says, is urban spaces, not confined by my cities, obviously, 27 square miles, but we're part of this powerful metropolitan region. And so I heard the cynicism when I began 15 years ago in Newark. I mean, literally, people saying awful things like we should just erase and start all over, or more really violent metaphors than that. But what we knew when we started talking to folks that helped us to do a real analysis of not just Newark, but the entire region, we saw immediately that there were an incredible hand of cards that we were played, that if we exploited the best of those strategies. We partnered with Michael Porter from the Initiative for Competitive Inner Cities. We met with the Regional Plan Association. And so we came in knowing we had sort of these assets. So even looking at the spending power, our residents we saw were spending between $500 million and $1 billion a year outside of our city on basic things like retail. We saw that there were these market sort of irrationalities that we could exploit, where people would bring goods and services into the third busiest port in America, the Newark port, and then put them on trucks and drive them out of our city to warehouse them way down on exit 8A on the Parkway. We saw that we had this incredible historic arts and cultural district that was really waiting for us to build upon. And so we began to exploit what we saw as a strength. And I believe that every city has a competitive advantage, that if they can pull all sectors together in their city and pull in the same direction, they can make incredible changes. So fast forward now, 15 years later, and last year, we're 3% of the state's population. But last year, 1/3 of all the commercial and multifamily development in the entire state of New Jersey was going on in Newark, New Jersey. The warehousing boom that we're having on our port area alone, creating thousands of jobs, companies from Pitney Bowes, Mimeo.com, Wakefern's largest refrigerated warehouse distributing from Baltimore to Boston, is all located in Newark because we've won that battle of proving that we could be a great transportation.
Well, you did a fast forward. Let me put you in reverse. When you go back, I don't know if it's 14 years or 13 years or 12, what is the tipping point? What's the crucial moment when you go from decline, looking like certain failure and doom, to success?
Well, I think that the point was made. I mean, you really need a great group of leaders, not just in government, but frankly in a lot of sectors that are willing to pull together and come together. And I'll never forget, I was asked, and I won't name the city, to my first term, we had incredible drops in crime. We were 40% down in shootings and murders. And so I was beginning to be asked, like I did, when I got into office, I went to Mayor Bloomberg, I went to Mayor O'Malley, I went to Mayor Rendell, these incredible, innovative mayors, and learned from them. I was now being asked by other mayors to come in the city, or other groups to come in the city and speak. And I spoke at this, I couldn't believe 800 people showed up to hear me talk, not just about crime reduction, but we were doing innovations in court innovation, prisoner reentry, urban farming. And so I got up, and some business people asked me to come into a room, and they sat me down and they said, look, we feel bad because we've had a lot of corruption in our city. We don't have sort of the mayoral leadership here. How do you get a good new mayor? And I said, you guys need to figure that out on your own. But ultimately, that's the power at the local level now, is there's such ripe opportunity to imagine, to innovate, to solve problems that are exciting to me. And we in Newark, there's so many other things I could talk about where we've seen a problem, seen an opportunity, and went to seize it. But sometimes we run up against the wall of state government, the wall of the federal government that does not have the flexibility or doesn't see problems even. At the federal level, often it's a very zero-sum game. If you win, I lose. At the local level, most of our lives, it's just not like that. You can create win-win-wins. And so we've been very fortunate in Newark to have a wonderful alignment of leadership across multiple sectors, from clergy, nonprofits, business, think tanks, and others, all willing to come on board. And partisanship doesn't matter at all. One of my biggest partners, and I've taken criticism for this as a Democrat, but it's been people like the Manhattan Institute, who helped us create one of the most comprehensive economic development initiatives, which is what? Talent. Men and women coming home from prison. We have a massive problem in America that we warehouse these productive actors at rates that no other country does. For the right, if you think there's a wasteful government, the Manhattan Institute, this is a big wasteful government. For us, as Democrats, to me, there's a moral cause in addition to that. And so they helped to set up a program where we're turning people that often are driving government expenses, courts, police and like, into productive folks who are now working on our urban farming initiatives, who are working on our clean and green team, doing a lot of our environmental work. So to me, that's the beauty of operating at this level is...
Well, you've opened up a follow-up, and I don't mean this to be a flip question at all. You talk about all this vibrancy at the local level, and that's where you started out in the dysfunction in Washington. And it's a serious question, why run for Senate then? What can you do in Washington that you can't do? No, seriously, I mean, just...
You heard about my Senate race. Look, it's really that hunger. Let's take one very finite problem that a bunch of mayors got together on 7 years ago. 7 years ago, we got together because we saw this grievous national problem, which all of our city, by the way, bipartisanship, independent, Democrat, Republican mayors got together on guns because it formed the Mayors Against Illegal Guns. And I started seeing right away that I'm fighting a problem at the local level that I will never be able to win unless we get federal policy aligned with what works. And by the way, this problem made me less of a reflexive Democrat, because I remember when the Heller decision came down, I've learned at the local level as a mayor to be driven by data and not ideology. And so when the Heller decision came down, overturned Washington, D.C.'s handgun ban, a lot of my friends on my aisle said, oh, it's so horrible, people in D.C. can buy guns. I went back and looked at my records in Newark, and nobody who bought a gun legally, I've had thousands of shootings since I've been mayor, nobody, with the exception of one person who was a correctional officer who used her sidearm in a crime of passion. But other than that, thousands of shootings in my city never done by law-abiding citizen. One. And so I knew immediately what the problem was because I captured these people. They were. I didn't do it myself. My police officers did.
You might have.
I mean, I'm patrolling the nights. But we are my incredible police officers. We did another great law enforcement action this past week, which was unbelievably heroic. But you stop these gun runners who are criminals, long criminal records, who go down south into the secondary markets, buy trunk loads full of weapons, and then drive, and they stop in Philly, Camden, Trenton, Newark, New York City, New Haven. And so for me, as a guy who's been seeing so much progress on local levels, and by the way, I love mayors. I mean, I learned so much from mayors in this country. You get, 10, 15 mayors. Bloomberg, I'm on his foundation board now. He brings together these incredible innovators that are thinking about problems in the most wonderful way, and we learn from each other. But this spirit needs to be in Washington. The Wall Street Journal wrote an article of just, I think they said 4 mayors in the history of America have been United States senators, something dramatic like that. It's ridiculous. We need to get more folks in Washington to start changing that spirit, to get back to a way of thinking that is not this short-term, painfully partisan, zero-sum game politics, and back to understanding what I understand the urgency. And I'll give you another example of this. I've got NJIT I've got 5 major colleges and universities. I'm one of the biggest college towns in the Northeast. People don't realize that about Newark. And I talk to my college presidents. We've set up these incredible business incubators. I just toured one in Chicago that blew me away. What we can do at the local level to stimulate the new tech economy. I'm perfectly positioned for that in Newark. And so, because I've got these universities, New Jersey as a whole, as I've been talking with Brookings, is one of the great states for patents, for research and development. We're just so perfectly positioned to be a state of innovation. But this is my problem. I've got people graduating from NJIT who want to stay in my city's business incubators that we've created, and yet they can't stay there because they can't get an H-1B visa. And so what do? They literally, I was in California, they were telling me about billboards that Canada has up, seducing folks. You can't get your visa here? Come start your company in Canada. So what I've realized is that this idea that folks at the national level really don't understand the incredible urgency that every year I'm losing job creators, I'm losing innovators, I'm losing the advantages I could use to turn my city around. And for a guy that still lives in a city that has high poverty, where I see the unfinished business of America every single day, where I come out of my house in the morning. When I became mayor, I wanted to move into the sector of my city with the most shootings, high poverty. And so I see this urgency every day, but I now know, 7 years of being mayor, I've proven, I always say that I used experiential longitudinal study, just living my life. That I've proven this theory to myself, that I know for a fact, after seeing all the cynicism about Newark and the progress we made, people told me what couldn't be done. Now I know there's nothing we can't do. It's not a matter of can we, it's do we have the collective will.
You need to scale up.
Yeah, we have it on the local level, but we need to get that collective will on the national level.
He's thrown so much out there, Bruce. I want to follow up on the issue of crime, because we talked a little bit about Chicago. In your comments there, you see all the work being done in Chicago now on economic development,
Absolutely.
on innovation,
Absolutely.
yet all the headlines about crime. How much of that is the threshold issue for a mayor? And unless you solve that first, none of the rest gets done.
Well, we usually tend to talk about mayors having to ensure safe streets, good schools, though many of them don't actually run the school system, and efficient services. And when you set that platform, investment can happen, people can live their lives, grow jobs, grow prosperity. So you can never run away from the crime problem, right? But I do think what has happened in this country over the last 30 years, if you see the trajectory of where we see mayors innovating and networks of leaders innovating, if you go back 30 years, we talked about mayors doing community policing, right? We talked about mayors beginning to engage with networks around school reform and making government services more efficient. Now they've graduated up the scale. Now you see cities beginning to invest in infrastructure, in transit, in ports, in airports. A lot of this are local resources, metropolitan resources, which are then leveraging private capital. And frankly, since the end of the recession, because Washington has begun to go on a frolic and detour, they're now getting at the really guts of the economy, right? An economy fueled by innovation, ideas, and manufacturing. We just did a manufacturing initiative with the mayor and networks of leaders. We can make things again in the United States, and by doing so, we can basically enhance innovation and serve many of these kids, frankly, coming out of high schools or perhaps coming out of community colleges with good jobs, good wages, good benefits. So what I've seen over time is mayors never can run away from the basics and the fundamentals. Never can run away from that. And if you do run away, you'll be punished at the ballot box. But what we've seen is them graduate up the scale and have to take responsibility for things perhaps in the past they felt, well, isn't that a Washington responsibility? Or maybe the governor deals with that or the state legislature. I think folks understand, we're pretty much on our own now. And we're just going to have to get our collective act together. And as Jennifer was saying before, form the networks, set a vision, find your
Another
game changer.
perfect example. Go ahead.
And I think that mayors also see, and I'll speak for Cory here, that the crime problem isn't an isolated problem, right? The crime problem has to do with jobs. It has to do with opportunities. It has to do with transportation and access to jobs. In Washington, people are used to thinking about things, as you know, in terms of the department, right? It's the crime bill, that's up to the AG or a particular congressional committee. If it's jobs, we sort of whipsaw over to commerce or whomever. A mayor sees the whole spectrum, and city leaders, the networks of leaders, also understand that this is not one problem. It's a web of things, and so you can't incarcerate your way out of your crime problem. You probably can't even put. You can use that if you want to. You may not even be able to patrol your way completely out of your crime problem. It has to do with the kind of opportunities and the kind of broader systems. And mayors and their networks of civic, philanthropic, religious, and other kinds of leaders are having to work on all of it at one time. And it's a hard job, and it's what they do.
And there are two things that they have at the level of integration. They have amazing local data, And so often they will use GPS mapping of crime in order to decide where to do economic development, where to deploy other kinds of resources. And they're really effective at data mining and trying to put all of these things together. The other point is that I served on a White House commission on looking at community-based solutions. And we called these youth, I think with real intention, not just because it sounded cute, opportunity youth rather than disadvantaged youth, because we really felt that we should stop labeling them as the problems and start trying to figure out where to create on-ramps for opportunity. And the scan of the White House Commission showed extraordinary things again going on at the local level, much more cost-effective, much less expensive than all of the federally funded workforce development programs for these youth at risk. So again, coming from a whole different angle, we saw where the innovation was coming from. It was coming from looking at community-based solutions to these issues.
And connected to that, one of the most fascinating things I thought that you wrote about in the book, both of you, is the experience of the city of Houston.
Absolutely.
And how they've taken these neighborhood networks to embrace the challenge of immigration, figure out how to deal with diversity, how to deal with the cultural challenges. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and how it's connected, again, to the other big debate going on federally right now on immigration reform. How necessary is that?
It's a little strange to talk about it because the woman who we write about, Angela Blanchard, is actually in the audience. I mean, it's almost like an old Groucho Marx television show here. You know, what Houston, the signal they send is we are an open, welcoming community where everyone can come and build a life. It is one of the most diverse communities in the United States. And what Angela has built with neighborhood centers is essentially a network of 21st century settlement houses, right? It's the world in a zip code in many of these neighborhoods. And what they're doing with many of these new immigrants is helping them learn English as a second language, helping them get low-cost banking, helping educate their children through charter schools, helping get access to health care. It's just an incredible situation. And I have to say, when you go to the Gulfton neighborhood, as Jennifer and I have both gone, and you see the neighborhood center, it's the most colorful set of buildings in the entire neighborhood. Across the street is a typical government building, bars, wires on top. There are no gates to the neighborhood centers. The community owned that building. There's no graffiti, right? Because they respect the people who live there, and people understand this is our path forward as people, as families, as a community. And, you know, frankly, I think, and Judith and us did a project together a couple years ago called State of Metropolitan America, the United States is demographically blessed. You look across the world to many of our competitor nations, they have aging population like we do, they have no substitute coming in, right? Because our narrative is a nation of immigrants, right? And so the immigration bill now being debated in Washington is very important to set a new standard and a new platform. But frankly, at the city level and at the metropolitan level, they do immigrant policy, right? They're the places that actually have to help these people access, integrate, assimilate into the mainstream so they can become entrepreneurs and productive citizens. The Houston story is an amazing story, and Angela is an amazing entrepreneur. Angela.
Did you miss anything?
Oh, here she is.
Just to flip it around, and I've already talked about the negative consequences of Washington not acting, but there's other issues. So what we've done in New Jersey by not dealing with the federal issues is you begin to drive that population underground, where they become more victimized by crime, where they're not reporting things that are happening in their neighborhoods. And so we're actually working with the ACLU right now to try to figure out a way to celebrate the type of visa that's allowed for people who actually do engage in helping with some of these problems. And so that's the problem. We've created that underground economy, that underground lifestyle of a lot of these folks. And we don't realize how profitable they are, or productive they are is a better word, for our communities, and if they're given the ability to contribute fully.
Yeah, the work that Angela has done helping immigrants prepare tax returns, for example, has brought $41 million back into the Houston economy. It's because they are, getting the refunds that they're eligible for. These are people who are building Houston, and they are making huge economic contributions. And so the more that that can be foregrounded, but I think, I have to be scrupulously neutral about all political races, including any Senate races that might be run on an unusual schedule in a neighboring state. But I think Angela would like to say a lot to Cory about how the federal government actually makes it harder for her to do what she needs to do through inflexible funding streams, through inconsistent reporting requirements. Neighborhood Centers has an IT system that would make an investment bank kind of blanch, because they've got so many different handcuffs placed on them by the federal government. And it's just another example of the way the federal government is so important, but it needs to put itself in service of metropolitan areas. Instead of kind of dictating and driving stuff down, the federal government needs to be a partner and a supporter.
Okay, but we're going to go to audience questions in 1 second, but I just want to go once around the table, and Amy Lou is here to do that. She's been called the Asian Oprah, I was just told. Giving relief for me. My bet, I will literally fall asleep in 10 minutes. So I'm going to run out in a second, but I want to go around the table quickly first and say.
This is your bedtime
Oh,
story.
it is my bedtime. I want to learn one more thing. Okay, you're emperor of the world. You've learned so much about cities. If you could do one thing, and I'll ask each of you this, to continue to foster this metropolitan revolution, what would it be?
Education, education, education. And frankly, not just the way we talk about it now, where everyone should get a 4-year degree. We can make things in the United States again. We have to go back to vocational education and help kids in high school basically move directly out of high school into good jobs, technology jobs in manufacturing and in the service sector. So education, but more broadly defined.
Yep. Well, I certainly agree with the education, obviously, and in all of this, but I would add this capacity to be resilient, because we can make all of these investments, but if we can't build resilient communities, resilient economies, against all of the things that are happening and will increasingly happen, we will keep slipping back. And so it's a critical piece of this puzzle.
I would encourage all metropolitan areas to understand that it really is up to them, and the solutions are not things you can just sort of take off the shelf. Just because somebody else had success with a stadium project, that may not be where your future lies. Every metropolitan area has assets. Sometimes those assets are hiding under the name of problems, right? Because they're undocumented people, or they're a large, returning prison population, or there's something else. But every place has assets. And Angela likes to say that change begins with the first new question. So I think the first new question for all metropolitan areas is, what's good about our place? And once they start to build on that, they're unstoppable. And given that I'm emperor of the whole world, that's how I could see change happening, not only in the United States, but across the country, is when people start to say, what's good? Because there's always going to be something good, and they build on that.
That's great. So first of all, you are the male Oprah, so you're a Mopra. Already taken education. It's the biggest national security threat we have in the United States of America is our failure to educate large sectors of our population and our undereducation of our population in terms of the skills that are needed in the 21st century economy. It is a powerful national security threat. If America is ever to decline, it will not be because of external threats. We pull together and really rally towards external threats. It'll be because of our ability to focus on the values. It gives every American opportunity. The second thing real quick is just the cynicism of our country has got to stop. It is an affront to our history. American history is a testimony to the perpetual achievement of the impossible. And by helping our city get over cynicism, by getting people who sit on the sidelines thinking democracy is a spectator sport, getting them in the game has allowed us to do infrastructure, transform our city parks because of the participation of citizens, transform city housing opportunities, doubling the production of affordable housing, not because of federal grants, but because of people getting involved. But the last thing I'll say, which is probably just not a popular thing, but it's such an issue for me and it circles us back around to education, is in the United States of America, the criminal justice system is so crushing our country. It is this unbelievable warehousing of human potential. It creates powerful cementing of legacies of racism and poverty. New Jersey, for example, has blacks are 13-14% of the population, over 60% of the prison population. The children most likely to go to prison are children of incarcerated adults. We have a system that disincentivizes people coming out of prison from getting into work. It's costing us billions of dollars of our national treasure, and we're missing out on billions of dollars of productivity. A lot of it has to do with educating, because we cannot incarcerate our way out of this problem, but it also is an attitude shift of our country to see the dignity and worth and value of every one of our citizens, and to do things to do something about it. And so instead of just saying that pretty rhetoric, I'll give you one example. Practically, innovation in our city is we took dads coming home from prison who otherwise would have had high recidivism rates, and we saw them as the most important people in our community. We created a fraternity of men for guys coming home called Delta Alpha Delta Sigma, dads. We gave them parenting training, mentor fathers, because we all need a mentor. I've needed mentor mayors. We gave them group activities for their kids. We brought them together with the women who are mothers of their children, because there's disincentives, economic disincentives for them to come together, because child support payments collect in arrears when you're in prison. Long story short, that program in Newark has taken recidivism from in the 60s to below 10%, I think 7% exactly. But more importantly, empowered a generation of kids that now will not have that high incarceration rates. We have solutions to these problems. It's not a matter of can, it's a matter of will. We can take these islands of excellence and make them into a hemisphere of hope.
Thank you all. I'm going to turn you guys over to Amy and everyone here. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. At one point, I did think about becoming the next Connie Chung, but I think that we all just witnessed exactly why we are so grateful that we have a George Stephanopoulos who's been such a thoughtful interrogator. Please join me in giving him one more round of applause. So my name is Amy Liu, and I'm the co-director of the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, and I have had the benefit of just witnessing all the energy and innovation in our cities and metropolitan areas over the last 16 years of being at Brookings. But in this particular moment, I am really pleased to be able to present some of the great questions that came from many of you, and I can tell there are some very common themes emerging from the questions, and I do want to reinforce there does seem to be a real sense of pessimism about the ability for our national government to solve the biggest problems of our times, and therefore a real desire by many of you to really understand, are our cities and metropolitan areas ready for this new challenge? So let me go ahead and ask the first question, which is came from a number of our audience members, which is about the size of the city. There's been a lot of anecdotes and stories today about large cities and big coastal cities. How does the metropolitan revolution work for small and mid-sized cities, particularly small and mid-sized cities who may or may not be equipped to compete on an international stage? What do you say to those leaders?
Sure.
I'll start out by saying that small and medium-sized cities actually have tremendous assets. They tend to be exceptionally oriented towards exports. So one of the most export-oriented economies in the United States is Wichita, Kansas, because of, well, it used to be, because of the aircraft that was made there. Youngstown, Ohio, incredibly export-oriented. The world still wants what Youngstown makes. So I think if these cities understand what the next economy is, and that they really are players on the global scene. They don't have to be on the coasts, they don't have to be on a border, but they still are players in the global market. That goes to data and understanding what they trade and who they trade with. That's a powerful force for economic growth and economic engagement. I think also what you learn when you go around the country is that the places that do best do what Mayor Booker talked about. He didn't see his place as just Newark in some sort of isolation. He understood Newark's role in the larger New York metropolitan area.
The Newark metropolitan area.
Newark metropolitan area, Newark. We talk in our book about Northeast Ohio, and we use the unwieldy term Northeast Ohio rather than Cleveland because that economy is being turned around by, a large city in Cleveland, but also by the Akron, Canton, and Youngstown metropolitan areas. They worked together on an economic strategy, and they were able to compete together for a big federal grant that's going to sort of put a big 3D printing, which is a new kind of manufacturing revolution technology, in Youngstown. And it's because it wasn't just Youngstown, it was going to be all these places working together. So I think that the revolution is incredibly relevant for small places, again, because of their potential for global engagement, but because they're never by themselves, right? They're always part of a larger metropolitan system, and that's where the power is. That's how they're going to be able to compete with the international powerhouses of Shanghai and Bangalore, not by themselves, but with their suburbs and with their near urban neighbors.
You know, Judith mentioned Jane Jacobs, and Jane Jacobs wrote really the iconic book about cities, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And in that book, she said the foundation of cities is trade. And one of the things we need to understand, we live in a world where 95% of the consumers are outside the United States. Only 13% of our economy is dedicated to exports. For decades, the United States has looked inward for growth, and now we need to look outward, partnering with the new great cities of the rising world. And I think what that means is cities, big, small, need to understand, go back to the basics. What do you make? What services do you provide? What do you trade? And who do you trade with, both within the United States and outside the United States? And that will power us forward.
And one of the most interesting things in their early work that they found is that all across the country, the mean number of countries with which the United States and these metro regions exported was 2, Mexico and Canada. Well, once you're mobilized to become an export economy, and you're really focused on what the capacity of the world is to receive your goods and services, it opens an extraordinary horizon that many of these businesses working alone or in regions that were too small really failed to dare to imagine that they could undertake. And part of this effort is to get them to imagine. We talk about all of the other things that are going to help the American economy get back on its feet and fuel the next phase of economic growth. It really is that kind of realization that small business and medium-sized business, which is at least half of the American economy, by linking into these metro regions and creating a system, an engine for growth, really can fuel the next phase of the American economy.
Let me just Judith, if I can do a Brookings commercial for a second, because I mean, this is the powerful thing that I've got from my relationship with Brookings is that they brought in a real analysis of our manufacturing sector. We started seeing the nascent potential that we had with a manufacturing sector that's bigger than most New Jerseyans really think. Hundreds of manufacturers based in Newark, employing thousands of people. But we were missing some of the basics. They put a fellow in with us, 2 fellows actually, did an analysis of our sector and helped us to see clear strategies with which we could further expand and connect to the global economy. So the ideas are there. With the right analysis, America could be doing, and I know this for Newark, we could be doing so much more in trade and gearing ourselves towards a global economy. And the jobs, I should say, and again, cannot forget the connection to the indigenous populations in many of our cities. The jobs are great because manufacturing jobs earn significantly more than the median wages in our city. So it's a very great sort of rich opportunity for, and I said this in a recent talk with Brookings, that the manufacturing that disappeared from the Northeast was the gateway for many families, including mine in the auto industry, out of poverty into the middle class. Well, this era is now returning to America to do that yet again, to take many people from my community, many people in the urban areas, to give them a gateway into stable jobs and professions.
So next set of questions are really about the fiscal resources and capacity of the cities and metropolitan areas to act on the big solutions of the day. And so I'm going to ask 2 questions related to this theme. So one is really in response to, Bruce, your setup about the fact that At the national level, we're going to start to see this crowding out effect. The aging of the population is creating greater investments in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and a lot of the entitlement spending we're seeing at the national level. But those forces are also happening at the locals level, where pensions are starting to crowd out local budgets. So how do we talk about the fiscal capacity of cities in that regard? Because there are similar challenges going on. The other is ballot measures. We have talked about the opportunity to use ballot measures as a way of raising revenues and getting voters more involved in state and local decision making. But one person in the audience was really worried about the role of big money, Koch brothers, and those kind of investments in sort of torquing the way local and state decision making can be done. So talk about these two issues when we think about fiscal capacity.
Well, Judith talked a little about this before. Cities are networks. They're not just government. So first and foremost. And, I'll go back to Detroit, because Detroit is the iconic image of failure today in many respects, and yet they've got Henry Ford Health System. They've got Wayne State University. They've got the Detroit Medical Campus. They've got the College for Creative Studies and new small batch manufacturing. They've got the Woodward Light Rail. I mean, there are many institutions with their own capital base that have the ability to invest themselves and to attract other private and civic investment. At the end of the day, there are many ways to skin a cat, so to speak. There are many ways to build a bridge or finance a port or finance an airport extension or a smart grid. I mean, we have to get more creative here. That's what happens, when the money begins to squeeze at the national level. I was in Dallas-Fort Worth a couple of weeks ago with Amy. We went out to the airport, Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, one of the great airports in the United States. It's the reason why that region is so powerful in many respects. It connects to so many parts of the world. They're doing a new extension, $2.3 billion. The federal contribution to that extension, $9 million a year. I mean, we can figure this out. It would be nice to have a national government that functioned. We would all at some point like that, but we're not going to wait for it because we have too many challenges and frankly, we have too many opportunities. And what you were describing before, Judith, was the ability for the United States to innovate and be creative, to provide us not just the infrastructure we need, but the education and skills we need, and ultimately the commercialization of innovation we need. We can do this. We really can do this. And when I look around the world and I look to our competitors, no one has this level as powerful, as networked, as entrepreneurial as the United States. So we're just going to have to get about the business of creating.
I want to say two other things about government and the money. There isn't enough money in government to solve all the social problems and economic problems in the United States or anywhere in the world. That's what we're finding. So the question is, how do we crowd in the kind of private sector capital in a positive way to enable social progress? Here, governments need to fund, but they also need to create the right enabling environment, the right policy framework, to allow some forms of capital. And not every place in government or in a region is appropriate for private capital with some of the concerns that we've heard. But there's also a tremendous amount of innovation going on, not only in infrastructure financing, as we talked about earlier, but a new phenomenon that we actually at Rockefeller brought from the UK to the United States called social impact bonds. These are bonds that are floated in order to pay for very proven social programs that have great empirical data. How do you prevent recidivism back into prison? What are the great social programs for homelessness? California's doing one now in childhood asthma. And the idea here is that instead of relying on government to do the social programs, which they're not always good at in every place. Cory talked about the amazing things he's doing, but often government is less good at running some of these social programs than the non-governmental actors in civil society. They get a chance to take these proven programs to scale. The actuarial event is the figuring out of the pricing of the bond at the level of their performance, the social program's performance, that makes it cost less for government to pay back a private investor for buying the bond than it does for running the social program, particularly one that's ineffective. So we see a Bloomberg one on recidivism here, now backed by Goldman. We're about to announce one with another large bank that is for New York State. Massachusetts has them. Illinois has just adopted one. We're seeing them at the local level as well. This is a way to take a positive capacity that commercial capital will have and could have, and allow social programs and social progress, again, to get taken out of the hands of government when it is a less effective actor than a social organization with much better track records. So as we see all this innovation, we have more, not less, confidence that the resources are there. But just as we're innovating around the technology and the economy, we need to innovate in the 21st century around how we're going to finance this, and not always rely on government to do it alone.
I want to go to the bond measure question.
We actually have, I was told I had one last question, but there are so many good ones. I'm going to try. She's going to kill me, but I want to try to squeeze in 3 other questions.
This is the
and I'm going to
trifecta.
ask all of you to try to keep your answers brief, because I do think there are some really good issues being raised by the folks here. So I'm going to just jump to the next one. And this one I'm going to ask Judith, which is the fact that this is coming at a time when the metropolitan moment is coming at a time when the world is rapidly urbanizing. And we all saw the piece in the New York Times this weekend about China. So the question is, what are your thoughts about China's ability to handle 250 million more people into its urban areas? I'm sure you could say this is true for your observations in India and others. And then there was a P.S. Cory, are you single?
Well, I'll answer that.
But Judith, why don't you give us your sense of
and very quickly, Rockefeller works all around the world. It is America's first global philanthropy, and so we've had a lot of experience in seeing this. The urbanization that is happening around the world is a tsunami. And so 75% of the world's population is going to be living in cities by 2030. It is happening most rapidly in Africa and Asia. China is planning for it and they have the resources to do that planning. I'm not going to speak to whether their mechanisms, obviously they're using force and eminent domain in order to get people from their villages and their land. I'm not sure that's a procedure that I would like to advocate, but their planning and the very high level of thinking that's going into that planning is extremely compelling. India is exactly the opposite. So you take the other really large, globalized economy, very poor planning, no system of municipal governance at all, and yet these cities are growing. They are growing in slums, and that's true of many other parts of Asia and virtually every city in Africa except in South Africa. So we have a horrific problem globally due to urbanization. China may be the exception in a way, and their problem may not be the planning, but the social unrest that will inevitably come from that planning. I think I'm entirely confident.
And between you and Mayor, both from the international perspective, the domestic perspective, will our cities be able to solve this, be able to rise while having a lot of poverty still in our cities, whether it's domestic or globally?
Look, I get frustrated, and one of the reasons why I'm hoping to go to the United States Senate is that nobody wants to talk about poverty in the United States. And we have a severe poverty problem in America, and large percentages of our kids are born below the poverty line. And I got very sort of fatigued in the last sort of set of national elections where everybody wanted to talk middle class, middle class, middle class, and really ignore the plight that we have of not just poverty, but generational poverty that we're not breaking. And so until America, and again, I do believe, just like I said, in a foreign threat, terrorist attack, we will unify as a country to deal with sort of that obvious external threat. But the challenge is we're not unified as a country to deal with issues like the crushing impact of poverty. And we live in such an interconnected society that most people don't understand the cost of poverty. And if you're poor and uneducated, you have higher medical costs to society, higher dependency on government programs, higher healthcare costs, as well as incarceration rates. So to me, I just think we need a much more national focus, but not necessarily in the old ways that we heard these wars on poverty and the like. The reality is what we're finding in Newark is that there are proven pathways to empower people to succeed. And so I'm sorry, we can't continue to do things over and over again, largely ignoring problems. We really need to start focusing, education, training. We have a real problem in America that nobody's talking about, that from the time a child is in their womb to their first year, where about 80% of their cognitive development is going on, we're not doing things that are financially proven to drive up success. Just home visits, for example, reduce juvenile neglect and some of the ill effects of poverty that are small investments with huge returns. We're battling right now about programs like nutrition programs for families, which is just ridiculous. It's any balance sheet analysis, investments here have back. So we've got to start changing the conversation. And if people want to do it from a balance sheet analysis, which I love to do because I can show you that investments in certain programs in the short term save money in the long term. The second thing I just want to say on the point about this crushing pressure on American cities right now. You have, obviously in Michigan, cities being taken over with a lot of their powers being taken over by the state, which is kind of crazy in and of itself, that this larger bureaucracy thinks that they're going to run a smaller bureaucracy more efficiently when most states have their own problems with pension obligations. We have to start to really change the conversation again in our country. And I know I'm racing, but I saw how an out-of-control mortgage lending industry created with outrageous avarice caused damage in my city. I saw how rating agencies over leveraged banks cause problems in my city. There's got to be a balance now between understanding a new capitalism of opportunity creating, partnering with cities that are doing things like we're doing. We're 25% less personnel in my city, but yet we're creating incredible rises in productivity. And it's a lot to try to say in a short answer, but I'll conclude by saying this. There has to be a reprioritization of the domestic emerging market that's not Mumbai, Dubai, pick your country. The domestic emerging markets will fuel our economy, and there's got to be a new capitalism of opportunity focused on issues like poverty and economic opportunity.
Great, thank you. Bruce? You're going to get the last word, and you have one sentence, I was told, to do it in.
This is my co-director.
All that media training is going to be put to good use right now, which is this. If the Metropolitan Revolution succeeds, what would we have accomplished?
It's the subclause of our book. We will fix our broken politics and renew our fragile economy.
And with that, please join me in thanking our panelists, Bruce, Judith, Jennifer, and the mayor. I want to thank all of you for staying with this program tonight. Please buy the book, Metropolitan Revolution, which you can find in the lobby. Please get involved in the dialogue and the movement at the website, www.metropolitanrevolution.org, where you can find some free apps and blog. And please participate in the change in your city and your region. Thank you, and have a good night.